This is video 2 for chapter 12. In this video, we will be focusing on the problems associated with work and the workplace. So this is an overview of the problems that your chapter identifies. You'll find that for a few of them, I combined them because they related to very similar issues. We'll have the dual labor market. We'll talk about workplace safety and workplace alienation. We'll talk about the McDonaldization of jobs, the rise of temping, as well as the gig economy, unemployment, and then a discussion of underemployment and how that relates to the low wage recovery. Institutional discrimination and job segregation, we will talk about jointly. And then we'll talk about unionization as well as what is commonly referred to as right to work laws. So beginning with our discussion of the dual labor market. So in the dual labor market, we talk about there being a primary labor market and a secondary labor market. Another way of just kind of conceptualizing this in your mind is good jobs, bad jobs. Largely, jobs that we consider to be good jobs are in the primary labor market. These are the jobs that we often refer to as careers or professions, and they normally require post-secondary education or extensive kind of training. They're jobs that often have, if not good pay, at least stable pay, usually in the form of salaries, and they provide extensive benefits. So these are jobs where everything from healthcare to disability to maternity, paternity leave are regularly provided, as well as some type of retirement type of savings. So these are jobs that are oftentimes associated with white collar jobs and professions. The secondary labor market, these are jobs where people oftentimes make significantly lower pay, and usually it's wage based and not salary. And that's important because if you think about what's happening right now with people being asked to shelter at home, if you have a salary job, you are probably still collecting your salary. However, if your job was wage based and based on the hours you work, is probably it's much more likely that you are now currently not getting paid because you're unable to work. These jobs, oftentimes secondary labor market jobs, have much fewer benefits or not as extensive benefits. A lot of service jobs, so retail clerks in a variety of shops and stores are considered to be part of the secondary labor market, as is restaurant work, telemarketing, maintenance, housekeeping. If you work in like the hotel industry, a lot of that work is what we consider to be secondary labor market work. Oftentimes these jobs have little opportunity for advancement. For people that are concerned about the dual labor market, the other issue is despite maybe the number of years of experience or skills that you might obtain in the secondary labor market, usually there isn't a smooth pathway from moving from the secondary labor market to the primary labor market. So what I mean by that is, let's say that you worked as a hotel, front desk person for like even 25 years. So you really know the hotel industry. That being said, you probably won't get an upper level management position, especially if you lack a post-secondary credential, despite all of those years that you spent on the job, right? So the time that you spent in the secondary labor market usually is not sufficient to get you a toehold in the primary labor market. And so that is a big concern that we have about the dual labor market, especially given the number of women, racial minorities, and the increasing number of young people that kind of find themselves stuck in the secondary labor market. Second problem, worker safety. And so, despite the actions of the government, and they've done several things. More recently, they established OSHA in 1970, which is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, to regulate workplace health and safety. In 1976, they passed the Toxic Substances Control Act, to try to provide some type of oversight for jobs where workers are frequently in contact with or handle toxic substances. Despite the government's kind of role in addressing workplace safety, there are still issues in a lot of workplaces. In 2012, for instance, 1.2 million workers had disabling accidents. And I give you a little infographic about OSHA violations, the top 5 OSHA violations that people often, or that businesses will face: fall protection, hazard communication, scaffolding, respiratory protection, and control of hazardous energy. And as you can see, when businesses don't comply, usually they pay, significant fines. And so you see that in 2018, the largest fine was to a grain milling facility that was found guilty of 14 willful violations, and it led to a $1.8 million fine. And all of this just kind of goes back to our discussion from last chapter about why America is not considered a capitalist economic system. Why is it considered a mixed economy? And one of the things we talked about was the role of the government. And part of the reason why the government plays such a critical role when it comes to worker safety is because oftentimes it does cost businesses money to kind of enact and put these protections in place. And if they did not have the fear of government oversight and government fines, oftentimes maybe they would just choose to not necessarily worry about worker safety, and would instead prioritize money over their workers' safety. So this is just one way in which you can kind of see how the government intervening in the business world is meant to be a good thing. But despite this government intervention, people still have these disabling accidents, and people do experience, workplace fatalities. Oftentimes when you think what the most dangerous job is, oftentimes people will say things in, the law enforcement field, or, or firefighters, and they'll be like, those types of fatalities are outside of people's control. But actually, those aren't the most dangerous jobs. Usually every single year, the most dangerous jobs are jobs that we see in the primary sector of labor, jobs that work with things like, mining and logging and fishing. Usually those 3 jobs are some of the most common for being the most dangerous, at least in terms of fatalities. In this particular year, from this Business Insider article in 2018, it was loggers. That was the most dangerous job. If you want to click through that list, you might find some of that information a little interesting, which is why I included the link. And your book does discuss this, right? The accidents that happen in the mining field, as well as the fact that, long-term, they're at great risk of developing respiratory diseases. Farming, we think about farming accidents, but oftentimes people aren't necessarily aware of all the toxic chemicals that farmers use and are exposed to, which can contribute to long-term chronic conditions. People who work in factories or nuclear power plants are exposed to toxic substances and radiation. And then, of course, there is workplace violence, which is not necessarily dangerous elements that are inherent to the job, but the fact that, every single year, there are people that commit workplace-based murders and or suicides. Especially for workplace murders, women are a particularly vulnerable demographic. So, workplace safety is an issue that we see in the United States workplace. And this infographic from your book makes the point that I just said, that it's especially the primary sector of the economy. So people that are doing things involved with the extraction or manipulation of raw goods. So this would be things like mining. This would be things like logging. This would also be like farming. And although the kind of technology and mechanics have made some of these jobs safer, oftentimes that powerful equipment carries risk of its own. And so mining as well as logging remain one of the most hazardous ways to make a living, along with farming, along with fishing, which has also been at the top of the list in years past. Now, let's say you don't have a primary sector job. Let's say you do have one of those tertiary sector jobs or quaternary, which are your service jobs and your office jobs. One issue that we see, or even secondary factory work, because alienation, and one of the earliest definitions was from Karl Marx, and he was specifically talking about factory jobs. And for him, he defined alienation as the experience of isolation and misery that comes from being powerless in the workplace. And that's because, according to Marx, work itself is a natural and satisfying act. People get satisfaction from doing work. And he was thinking about specifically back when people were, farmers or, or sheep herders, or, small, trade people that had trades, like, you made shoes, or, you were a blacksmith. He was like, producing something, being responsible and having that autonomy led to a certain amount of satisfaction, even if the work itself, did not make you a lot of money. For him, capitalism and industrialization, which he saw as going hand in hand, they alienate workers in four ways. It alienates them from their jobs themselves, because they kind of are now just kind of cogs in the factory, assembly line. And so this type of work is no longer natural or satisfying. It alienates them from the products they make, because unlike a crafts person who makes a pair of shoes, makes the entire pair of shoes, if you are making shoes on the assembly line, you aren't responsible for the whole pair of shoes, right? You can't point to a pair of shoes and say, I made that, no, instead, they're the people on the assembly line that, assemble the sole, and then they're the people that assemble the rest of the shoe, and then they're the people that thread the shoestrings, right? But no one is responsible for making the entire product, which according to Marx leads to a sense of alienation from that product. The third way that he said capitalism alienates workers is from each other, by oftentimes focusing on, output and efficiency. It kind of makes it harder to establish relationships with your coworkers, because instead now everything is so time driven. And then the final way was from their human potential, that no one is necessarily being the person that they could be, or living the life that they could have, or pursuing the profession that they could have, because instead they're kind of focused on, making this wage. So all of this, he said, contributes to this kind of sense of isolation and misery, which is what he said workers at the time that he was working, at the time he was writing, workers during this time were experiencing. Writing a little later, Max Weber also tackled the concept of alienation. He saw this a little differently from Marx. For him, alienation could best be thought of as the depersonalization of the workplace and throughout society, because of a rational focus on efficiency. If you recall from last chapter when I talked about bureaucracy, which is another one of Max Weber's kind of concepts, he thought that the rationalization of society was necessary because as we kind of change from societies based on kind of tradition to societies based on rationality and efficiency, that was kind of the hallmark of a modern society. A modern society was focused on this kind of rational authority and focused on efficient ways of doing things, not like we've always done it this way, but more like, okay, this is the best way of doing this in terms of we can produce more items or we can produce more items in a shorter amount of time. And so he was like, alienation is going to naturally result from that because of this impersonal focus, because it's now no longer about the people, it's about being efficient. And he did not necessarily feel like that this was a positive thing. He said that this lack of concern for the human costs of policies and practices obviously has some negative side effects. But at the same time, he kind of thought that this was really just the way of modern society, the way of the world, and that there was very little that can be done without kind of standing in the way of modern progress. And so most people today find it pretty easy to agree that many information age jobs do generate this worker alienation, that very few workers necessarily like their work, not to mention, of course, workplace isolation, that as technology has helped us do our jobs more and more efficiently, we find less reasons to have face-to-face interaction and contact with one another, including our coworkers. Your book mentions this when it talks about how even phone calls, have been replaced by, emails and even which are even more impersonal than phone calls, which replaced face-to-face meetings. So workers can spend their whole day not interacting with one another, with others. This is certainly true if you're telecommuting and working from home, but even if you're working in an office, what you kind of see there in the picture are, the cubicles, and the fact that more and more service work has moved to being online. So people aren't even necessarily working in cubicles. Like I said, they're working from home and telecommuting, all of which can contribute to the post-industrial society form of worker alienation, which in a lot of ways might be very similar to the definition of alienation that Marx offered back when he was focusing on factory work. The next problem of the U.S. workplace that your book tackles is McDonaldization of work. McDonaldization, and this relates a lot to what we were just saying about Weber and his focus on in modern societies, work is becoming depersonalized and efficiency is becoming more and more the primary goal. And that's exactly what we see when we consider this McDonaldization of work concept, because McDonaldization of work means that work is now largely defined in terms of it being efficient, predictable, uniform, and automation. The reason why they call it McDonald's is it's the idea that regardless of whatever McDonald's you go to, the interaction is going to go very similarly. The setup of the restaurant is largely identical. The menu is identical, and the food itself, regardless of who's cooking it, whether you're at a McDonald's in Gastonia, North Carolina, or New York City, or Dallas, Texas, or Lincoln, Nebraska. The idea is that because McDonald workers follow kind of the same order of operations and doing things, and they get their food from all the same place and they cook it all the same way, that is supposed to be this routine experience for the customer, and the idea is that customers like that. The problem is more and more jobs, more and more work has become McDonaldized, where there is this focus on things being efficient, then being predictable, then being uniform. And usually there is a use of technology in order to achieve those things. So there is also this kind of reliance on automation. And I guess, from a consumer point of view, this may not seem like a negative thing. I think the issue is that by stripping the potential for workers to personalize their jobs, for them to kind of be able to express their own autonomy and creativity, it makes the work even less desirable. And it's worth noting that these jobs, which your book refers to as McJobs, but this McJobs work is found throughout a lot of the secondary labor market, those kind of low skills, low paid jobs, which are then made worse by this focus on McDonaldization, which means that workers don't have a lot of satisfaction. Their jobs are really boring in the sense of that kind of predictability, uniform type of actions. And so they're very repetitive. And so for this reason, these jobs oftentimes have a lot of high turnover, in addition to them not being the best paid jobs. They don't offer their workers a lot in terms of the workers being able to express their individuality. Now, the second set of problems I just kind of put together, not because they are synonymous, but they're just very similar in terms of how we can see the labor force in America changing in a way that is potentially problematic. So we have a growth in part-time work, in particular temping, where instead of employers hiring their own employees and providing them benefits and kind of a pathway to build a history or tenure within the company, that for some jobs within the company they instead turn to temping services, which give them access to workers for a short period of time who they can often pay less money to. But even if they are paying them similar to what their own employees are making, the key thing is temps almost always get offered no benefits. They don't get offered any benefits from the company that they are temping for, or if they're going through an industry or a temping service, that service doesn't offer the temp benefits as well. So in addition to having work that's less stable and maybe more or less well paid, you are then responsible as a temp of having to do without benefits or cover them yourself, for things like medical or dental insurance. And you have even less control over your work than a person that's a full-time employee, which because of their the expectation that their job is a little bit more stable, they maybe have a little bit more room to make the job their own, to personalize it in some way, and to have more individual autonomy. So 19% of the U.S. labor force temps. And so, your book, as your book notes, that means that they are working, but they are usually working without retirement plans, sick leave, health insurance, and job security. So just in terms of their ability to take care of themselves and be self-reliant when perhaps things hit a rough patch, they're going to be even less likely to be able to do that than people who work full-time. A even newer work pattern is the rise of the gig economy. And so the gig economy are companies and organizations that contract with independent workers for specific work over a short period of time, for a gig, if you will. And so when I say gig economy, what are some businesses that might come to mind? If you look at that little infographic up there, Uber, Airbnb, Fiverr, Uber Eats, TaskRabbit, DoorDash, Lyft, all of those are examples of companies that make up the gig economy, where they aren't really, so drivers for Uber, it's not like Uber is offering them retirement plans or a set number of hours or benefits, right? Instead, they have an arrangement where for the gig, they will get a percentage of what the customer is paying, and then Uber gets a percentage as well. And so with the rise of technology and the app boom that we've seen in the last 5 or so years, we've seen this increase in the gig economy, and so it provides flexibility. To the workers, and it cuts costs for the businesses. And for consumers, it increases the perception of options, and usually also cuts costs for the consumers as well. Um, the positives of maybe the gig economy is it gives workers a greater freedom over their work schedule, and they get to try out different jobs. Their earning potential perhaps might be greater, because of how the gig economy is organized. They are not necessarily constrained by the kind of maximum hour work days, which means if you would like to work 18 hours, 20 hours a day across multiple companies that you've contracted with. So, maybe you drive for Uber X amount of days, and then you deliver food for DoorDash X amount of days. And then in your additional time, you do tasks that people, contract with you to do via TaskRabbit, across those multiple companies. You are not necessarily, you aren't protected by the maximum hour work days, but then in the same way, you aren't quite held back because you can work as much as you want to work. Now, of course, the primary negative is the same negative that was identified for temping. Usually, your benefits are diminished if they exist at all. Now, how much of this is an issue to you might vary based on, why you're engaging in the gig economy. If you are expecting that you're only doing it short time, or if you're doing it in addition to another job, which a solid number of participants in the gig economy, that is true for them, then this might not be problematic for you, the lack of benefits. But for people who ideally, would like a full-time job, but can't find one, and therefore they're kind of turning to the gig economy as a last resort, then the fact that they are not, guaranteed job stability or a set, salary, or provided any benefits, it might be much more problematic for them. Of what's concern, what is a concern to people who study the labor market is the rather large number of young people. That 22 to 34-year-olds, 43% are freelancers. Just looking ahead, it's kind of the same issue that we see with the primary and secondary labor market. If uh, if these people are not able to make a transition to a full-time kind of salaried job, and this impacts their ability to do things like buy a home or save for retirement, then in 30, 40 years, as they get older, this raises a real societal level concern about what's going to happen to them, if they don't have a retirement to draw from, or in more short term, like even just considering what's going to happen to them in their middle age if they, don't have good health insurance or access to health insurance. So all of that it just kind of raises a little bit of concern about, once again, who the gig economy is good for. It's good for, the board and the CEOs of companies like Uber and Fiverr, and maybe it's even good to consumers like I myself. All the times that I've moved and had to like put together furniture and pack, I've definitely relied on companies like TaskRabbit because it was less costly than going to a moving service. than going through like a moving company or a moving service. But who it may not be potentially good for are, the people that are making a living, particularly people that do not have a kind of long-term plan or option and are relying on gigs to cover their day-to-day as well as long-term expenses. So now we're going to talk a little bit about unemployment. It's worth noting that we're never at 0% unemployment. And so whenever our country is between 4 and 5% unemployment, we consider that to be normal. And we'll even talk about that as being full employment, because we kind of expect that at any given point, we're going to have about 4% or 5% of our population that is unemployed. And it's further worth noting, because I think this is really, really key when like people want to compare the unemployment rate in America to the unemployment rate in other countries where it's often higher. The unemployed, in addition to not including discouraged workers, people who aren't actively looking for a job and therefore aren't counted, the unemployment rate also does not include people who are incarcerated. Now, why is this important? You're probably like, well, duh, of course it doesn't include people who are incarcerated. They're incarcerated where they're going to work. Well, this is where, especially if you are comparing cross-nationally, it can be a little tricky. As we discussed in an earlier chapter, America is the world incarceration leader. At any given point, we are incarcerating a much larger percentage of our citizenry than other countries. And some of those people that we incarcerate are people who, if you're just looking statistically at how they would fare in the labor market, young male minorities, they would be people that would be driving our unemployment rate up quite a bit. So even when our unemployment is low, between 4 and 5%, and therefore we say we're at full employment, at least part of what keeps our unemployment at this rate is that some people who would struggle to find jobs are also people that we have incarcerated. And if we move towards a time where we try to, if we move into a transition of not incarcerating as many people, especially for nonviolent offenses, it's just worth noting that we will probably see our unemployment rate rise. So just looking over time, you can see that our unemployment rate, it's been between 4 and 5%, that we saw, a little spike in 2003, 2004. And then we saw that kind of dramatic spike kind of beginning in 2000, 2008, reaching almost 10% in 2010, the height of our kind of Great Recession. When America's economy was really going through a time, and it was reflected in the number of people who were unemployed but actively looking for a job. Now, your book talks about several reasons for unemployment, that sometimes businesses will purposefully cut their number of workers as a way to lower costs. And by doing so, it increases their profits. And they can kind of feel like that they can confidently do this because there will always be available labor. And so in this way, sometimes unemployment can be like cyclical. They discuss Piven and Cloward's theory that government expands welfare programs in weak economic times and then cuts programs in boom times. And so in that way, while it's horrible for the workers themselves, that especially this is kind of how we can go through these economic highs and lows without, our economy just totally falling apart. And these workers that kind of are most expendable during these weak and boom periods are oftentimes people who are less educated, And they note that the rate for high school dropouts is 3 times higher than for college graduates. Also, racial and ethnic minorities, and this is regardless of their educational status. And we'll maybe think and talk a little bit about why that's the case when we get to the issue of institutional discrimination and job segregation here in a second. And so if you're looking at this chart, this just kind of makes the point that unemployment affects African Americans the most, and then followed by Hispanics, and then whites. And once again, we'll kind of talk through a little bit more about why that might be when we get to our upcoming discussion about institutional discrimination. So as I've already discussed, theoretically, the economy operates in cycles, periods of prosperity followed by periods of recession, and that businesses, in order to remain solvent, when they are experiencing diminished profits, they will cut jobs because that will increase their profit margin. And that during this time period, the government will kind of respond to this by increasing welfare programs, expanding, unemployment, cash assistance, and expanding, our food stamps types of programs, being open to expanding Medicaid to provide health insurance for low income people, people that have experienced, maybe a dramatic reduction in income. But your book notes that one thing that is different from before, when you look at what happened after our last recession. So, we went through the recession, and now we're technically in what's called, a recovery period, a period of prosperity, if you will. But compared to previous periods of prosperity, our employment is still rather high. And your book notes several explanations for that. One explanation being that computer technology has literally, like I said, the robots have taken my last video, the robots have taken our jobs. Computer technology means that fewer people can do more work. Companies just demand more work from existing employees. And once again, technology has kind of contributed to that by blurring that distinction between, home life and work life, and people, especially people with salaries, are expected to do more work outside of work hours. There is that greater use of temporary workers. More jobs have become outsourced overseas, not just even our factory work, but some of our tertiary sector jobs, like call center jobs, have become outsourced to other countries. The economy is growing, but it apparently is not growing fast enough to absorb all the job seekers. And this is especially true as older people, the boomers, are delaying retirement, usually because the recession has impacted their savings and their pensions and their retirement. So instead of retiring and opening up jobs to younger people, they are remaining in the labor market, either holding on to jobs that they still have, or if they have lost a job, they are still looking to work, which means that they become part of our unemployment numbers, which retired people, if they were just fully retired, they would not be. And then your book makes the point that, U.S. workers are expensive and not highly skilled enough. So for the industries that maybe are seeing job growth, we don't have enough people in this country that have those necessary skills. A lot of them relate to STEM. And then for jobs that are not particularly high skilled, this is the flip side of, pushing for, a living wage, or, pushing for, a higher, minimum, wage. If employers have to pay that higher minimum wage, as opposed to cutting into their profits. For a lot of employers, the answer becomes they just hire less workers because those workers are more costly. So all of that means is that, after this last recession, it has not been followed by as strong of an economy as we would like. And one way we can think of this, or one way we can describe this issue, is that it has been what has been called a low wage recovery. So to the extent that we've recovered jobs, a lot of these jobs pay a lot less than in the past. Your book notes that before the recent recession, 2/3 of all jobs in our labor market provided a middle class standard of living. Now it's about half of the new jobs created in the last few years do the same. So jobs are paying less. And so this has been especially true for jobs taken by younger adults, which of course inhibits their ability to do things like buy homes, and pay off their student loans. Um, and then another issue that we see during this low wage recovery is that many Americans, especially younger adults, are what we call underemployed, meaning that they are employed at either less than full-time or regular jobs. So they're forced to be temps or part-time workers, even though they don't want to be. And it's worth noting that if you're a temp or you're a part-time worker, you are no longer part of our unemployment rate. So once again, when we're like the unemployment rate has gone down, it's worth noting that some of those people are people who are temping, or people who are are working part-time even though they would like a full-time job. The other kind of definition of underemployment also comes into play here in a low wage recovery, because it suggests that even if you're working full-time, you're working at a job that's inadequate in respect to your training or economic needs, meaning you make a lot less money than what your experience or your training or your education suggests that you should be making, or you're just making a lot. You work full time, but you make a lot less money than what you actually need. And so this just kind of shows you that our underemployment rate has always been higher than our unemployment rate, and that this has remained true during periods of recession as well as during our recovery from the recession. Our next set of problems I'm going to talk about jointly, because they kind of go hand in hand, and that's institutional discrimination and workplace segregation. So we've talked about institutional discrimination before, when we talked about the definition of discrimination, and we talk through the distinction of individual versus institutional discrimination. But a reminder of that definition: institutional discrimination is bias that's built into the operation of social institutions like the economy, education. And what's meant by it's built into the operation, it's built into kind of the regular policies, procedures, how these institutions are set up. And the result of this kind of built-in bias is that usually there is an underrepresentation of women and minorities in these occupations or in better jobs. And this is part of why we see more women and minorities in the secondary labor market than the primary labor market. And so, part of it might be, if you're wondering, like, what might be some policies and procedures that would be examples of institutional discrimination. Well, the big example that always comes up in education is, especially in private colleges and their reliance on, legacy admissions, or the set-asides that they have for, what they call development or donor admissions. Both legacy as well as donor admissions largely benefit people who come from wealthy and, in most cases, white families, compared to people that come from minority or lower income families. In the economy, if you're thinking about, people's ability to buy a home or receive loans, there are all types of policies that have been identified as being discriminatory, that can contribute to people being kind of locked out of getting mortgage loans, or getting their, getting something refinanced, or having a higher credit score, which is worth noting that having a high credit score, for some industries like finance, it is part of your, how you are ranked, and considered as a candidate. And so the other kind of thing that your institutional discrimination textbook discussion focuses on is the concept of the glass ceiling. That there is this invisible barrier that prevents women and minorities from moving up in organizations. And that's usually because in order to be an upper level management, there isn't a clear path that you can take. That you do all that you can do in terms of education and getting training and experience on the job, but then who gets tapped to be, CEO, CFO? A lot of that has to do with just individual board and trustee decisions, and usually women and minorities are just much less likely to get chosen than white males for those positions. And all of this kind of just contributes to the U.S. workplace being highly segregated by race and gender. That minorities, as well as women, are much more likely to be in the secondary labor market. White men are much more likely to be in the primary labor market. And it is that kind of segregation into these two markets that contributes to the income disparities that we see between racial and ethnic categories in the United States, much more so than them having the same job and just getting paid different amounts. Is the fact that even when we look at education levels and experience levels, oftentimes the types of occupations that people wind up in, industries that they get hired into, just wind up being very different, and come with a very different type of salary and benefit profile. And what we mean by workplace segregation, you can see here, we talked about this when we talked about gender, that a lot of professions have a gendered segregation. Some jobs are overwhelmingly female. Childcare workers, hosts and hostesses, personal care aides, cashiers, and some jobs are overwhelmingly male. A lot of things in finance and sales managers, surgeons, CEOs, and this is just largely focusing, and those were some of the higher paid occupations. A lot of the lower paid occupations that are predominantly women, or a lot of jobs that are predominantly women, are also part of that secondary labor market, that lower paid labor market. And your book makes a very similar point when comparing racial percentages across different types of jobs, that oftentimes African Americans and Hispanics are much more likely to be in that secondary labor market versus primary labor market. The last of the problems that your book discusses, that I will provide an overview in regard to, is unionization and right to work laws. So labor unions are worker organizations that seek to improve wages and working conditions through collective bargaining. And that collective bargaining usually includes a period of negotiations, and one tool that they use as a way to influence employers in these negotiations is kind of the possibility of a strike. In America, we have a long history of unions. They grew out of the labor movement in the 1930s. Very popular kind of union organizer at that time was Eugene Debs, who you see a picture of. And from that time period of the 1930s, unions experienced a brief decline during World War II, where President Roosevelt definitely limited some of their ability to do things like strike or walkouts during wartime efforts. But then unions kind of roared back to life post-World War II, and they peaked in membership in 1970s. Beginning in the 1970s, there's been a decline in union membership, and that's at least partially because a lot of unions are related to the secondary sector of the labor market, manufacturing. And as I discussed in the last video, deindustrialization, which kind of began in the 1950s, 60s, and then really increased in the 70s and 80s, meant that less of those jobs were available, which means there was a surplus of available factory workers, which made unions kind of less effective because there were always kind of strike breakers, people that they could use to break the strike, because people with manufacturing experience, there weren't enough jobs to go around, so they were more than happy, to get a manufacturing job, and so it made their collective bargaining tactics a lot less successful. Service work, because a lot of this job is low skilled, and not to say that anybody could do it, but the potential for anyone doing it is much higher than factory work. So service workers have never had the same type of successful unions as factory workers have done in the past. And this just shows you kind of the declining power of unions by looking at the number of labor strikes in recent decades. As you can see, there have been less and less strikes that have taken place. Unions today, as I've already noted, factory jobs declined, so did unions. That workers and service jobs, they've turned to unions, but they have not been as successful. Right to work laws, which we will talk about in a second, have also kind of changed union membership and have contributed to the declining union membership. Public employees like fire, police, teachers, they do have unions, but that certainly in conservative states, these unions have struggled in terms of how do they negotiate, and people oftentimes, because these public servants, their jobs are paid via taxes, there is usually not as much support from people when public service workers strike. Maybe the one kind of counterexample to that is kind of the growing awareness that in a lot of states we do not pay teachers enough, and there has been growing support for teachers striking in order to get better pay and better benefits. So one thing that has, as I indicated, that has limited the power of unions are the number of states that have passed right to work laws. And you can see that those are all the states that are in a green. Despite what they sound like, right to work laws doesn't really give you the right to work. What it does is it gives you, in those states, unions cannot make people pay union dues. And so as someone who has worked in a state that did not have a right to work law, because I was in California, what that looks like is we had the faculty union, and even if you weren't a member, you had to, dues were taken out of every paycheck, to go towards the union. And the argument kind of being is that because when the union would negotiate, it wasn't like they could only negotiate on the behalf of its members. They were negotiating on the behalf of everyone who holds the jobs. So, it kind of is if you allow people to elect to not pay dues, most people aren't going to want to pay dues because they're going to want to keep every cent of their paycheck for themselves. In my case, I think my dues were usually about $70 a month. If you think about what that adds up to, it's not an insignificant amount of money. But the problem is if people don't pay dues to the union, then the union isn't going to have the money to fund itself, in order to be able to do things like engage in collective bargaining. So what's happened is that a lot of unions just largely are unable to fund themselves and to do the work in right to work states. So even if unions exist in those states, they're usually, very weak because they kind of lack that funding. So that is it for this part 2. Kind of like the previous chapters, at this point of the semester, I really just hope that you all can kind of understand the discussion about the theories, the theoretical frameworks, and the political ideologies on your own, because it largely remains it remains very consistent chapter to chapter. We're pretty much almost always talking about the same handful of theoretical frameworks. Social conflict, structural, functionalist, symbolic, interactionist, in some cases, feminists, in some case, multicultural theory. And then we're almost always talking about the same political ideologies: conservative, liberal, and far left or radical left. In some cases, we also get far right. But at this point, you should not be relying on me to explain that material to you. You have the slides, and for that discussion, the textbook material should be sufficient. All right, so this is it for part 2 of chapter 12.